Yes, yes.
Now, which is it?
I'm sure of it.
Welcome back to Rod's Radios. This is a Bush model DAC90 that I acquired as part of a job lot some months ago. And when I saw it, I knew it was one of these iconic radios which really took my fancy, and I was looking forward to trying to restore it. It's a medium long wave and shortwave mains radio from around 1946. Now the cabinet, as you can see, was in a pretty poor and shabby condition. It was marked, it was dirty, the grille on the front was ragged, and I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to do anything with it, but I still liked the look of the cabinet. However, when I turned it around the back, I discovered that the interior had parts missing from it. Two of the valves were gone. The speaker was rusted solid, and there was a lot of deterioration on the chassis. So what to do? I was nearly ready to dump it. Then a mad idea jumped into my head. What if I cannibalized this radio and fitted a new transistorized module into it to kind of bring it up to speed and make it of some use after all? So as it happened, I had a transistor radio which was a shower radio, a small little transistor radio that I wasn't using. So I cannibalized it, and here we have the module in front of us that shows you what I intended doing. So the next thing was to strip down the chassis itself of the DAC90, and you can see here that all the valves have gone, the transformers have gone. The only thing remaining is the actual tuning capacitor. So the idea was that I would try and fit this radio in and link it somehow mechanically onto the old tuning condenser, so that when you turned the knob on the old radio, the new radio tuned in. Here's a front view of the stripped chassis where you can see the dial drive mechanism, and it's in pretty poor condition, and it's going to need a little bit of refurbishment as well. The next clip you'll see is actually a video message I sent to my daughter in Australia, because I know she has a 3D printer, and I wanted to outline her what I was going to do, and maybe she could help me. So you'll get the idea when you see this next carriage. And this is the old radio I was talking to you about. This is the chassis that I took all the bits out of, apart from the original tuning capacitor. And the way this works is that with this knob on the side, if you can imagine, this is the side of the cabinet of the radio and the chassis is fitted in. You turn the knob here, which has a gearing arrangement to turn the actual pulley on the tuning condenser, and that has a wire going up along the top here, which has a needle that moves up and down a scale to show you what station you're on. So the scheme was, anyway, to try and adapt this little transistor radio to work with this old-fashioned vintage radio. And initially what I was trying to do was to use the actual old tuning capacitor by taking away a lot of the vanes in here to match it up to the tuning capacitor that was on this. This is the modern tuning capacitor, the old tuning capacitor. So you'll see how far we've come over the years in terms of size. So anyway, that didn't work because I wired that tuning capacitor onto this transistor radio, and there was all sorts of interference, and it just was never going to work. So the next scheme is to try and use the actual tuning capacitor and link it mechanically onto the old tuning capacitor. So this is where you come in with the little shaft that I sent you the picture of. The idea being to join this shaft here onto that shaft there and suspend or mount the little transistor radio at that kind of angle there, so that you still have access to the knob here. It doesn't interfere with it. However, I don't know whether this is even going to fit in, but somehow I'm going to have to secure the printed circuit panel here, maybe by putting a strut across there at that point there, and a strut going down there to the chassis. So I don't know how that's going to work, but anyway, one step at a time. So that's what I'm trying to do. This is a dimensional drawing of the small part that I was asking my daughter to manufacture, and it was on this part that the whole project hinged. If this didn't work, I was wasting my time. In the meantime, while I was waiting for this small part to arrive, I turned my attention to the cabinet and started cleaning it. And it took a fair amount of cleaning it to remove decades of grime and dirt. However, it came out quite well. And I also managed to fit a piece of authentic cloth to the front as a speaker grill. However, after a week or two, I noticed that the cloth had started to sag, and it wasn't going to work out at all because it would have looked pretty rumpled by the time I came to fit the rest of the parts of the radio in. So I gave up on that and adopted a different ploy. Recently, I acquired some placemats, believe it or not, from a home store. And you can see 3 examples of them here. And I ended up using the one at the bottom because it ended up looking quite authentic for the period of this radio. And it worked out pretty well, as you will see. So, some weeks later, the little adapter piece arrived. Thank you, Holly. And as you can see, it's quite small, but it was vital to the whole project. You can see here also the tuning capacitor, how I was going to try and join it onto the old mechanism. And here's a close-up of the adapter piece now fitted into the old drum, waiting for the other part to be joined onto it, the actual transistor PC. I decided for this job that the radio would be completely transformed from what was an antique valve radio to a modern transistor radio. And what I've done is to first of all replace the on-off switch with a modern version to fit in with this transistor radio, because the value of the old pot was I think 2 meg and this one needed to be in the region of 10k. So a new volume control on-off switch, new mains lead with earthed contact here on the chassis for safety reasons. So the mains comes in here, it's fed via a fuse for safety reasons through the on-off switch and into this little transformer, the output of which gives 6 volts. This 6 volts is fed through a tiny little PCB board here with a bridge rectifier, and out comes 9 volts DC smoothed via this capacitor here and a little red LED just to indicate the power is working. I don't know whether you can see, but there is then a transistor, or at least a regulator chip up here to smooth the DC voltage further and reduce it from what the output of this is 9 volts down to 6 volts, because this is what our little transistor module needs to run. Before it gets to the module itself, I've fitted a couple of LEDs to light up the dial drive, because the idea of this was to retain the tuning effect of this control here so that the original dial drive would go up and down. However, instead of operating the original radio itself, I now have this little transistor radio. This was a shower radio that I cannibalized because I didn't need it anymore. But what happens is that the original drive of this antique radio now drives a modern module, transistorized module, which will be just an FM radio. And hopefully it'll all fit back into the cabinet when I finish up, and we'll have a radio of some form that at least looks as though it's an ancient radio, but in actual fact it's a modern FM radio. So let's see what happens. This is another view of the link between the old and the new. And this was the original tuning knob for the old radio, which turned this variable capacitor to tune in the various stations. But now it's linked mechanically via a plastic shaft to the tuning capacitor on this radio here. I repainted the back plate of the dial drive to make it show up better, and also, as I mentioned earlier, fitted some LEDs here and here, and there will be another one here inside the cabinet to light up the back plane of the dial drive, and also repainted the actual needle that runs up and down to indicate where the stations are. Of course, the original glass plate on the front showed up medium wave and long wave stations, and now we have an FM radio fitted to this, so it won't make any sense, but at least it will move up and down kind of authentically. This is how the cabinet turned out, and it was one of the reasons for actually going ahead with this daft project, I suppose. The design is absolutely classical for its era. The cabinet cleaned up really nicely. It's nice and shiny. The dial is in reasonably good condition. I did have to replace the cloth on the front here because the old one was in such bad condition. So now it's time to fit the chassis back in and see if we can get this to work in some fashion. The chassis has been mounted back into the cabinet, as you can see, and we're ready to try this out. You can see up here on the left the transistor PCB that has been heat glued into position so that it doesn't move independently of the actual tuning capacitor, which is now operated by the old mechanism. This is the old part of the radio with the big, what would you call it, disc here that drives the tuning capacitor. So let's see what happens. And here we go.
Started back, I was like, I should probably get a fantasy football team because then it will make it that a little bit more interesting. And I know I went off the ball right now. There's so many things.
You didn't go for that. It's a natural fact that I want to come back. Show me where it's.
I really enjoy watching our girls play, but I
Well, there we go. If not a restoration, at least a resurrection.